Hey, Truf, sorry, I didn't see the chat. So I was going to monitor the chat for questions and just let you know when people ask them. And then do you want me to just give you share screen capabilities?
Yeah, that's probably best. Can you not hear me?
Oh, sorry. Can you try again? I think it was a problem on my end.
Oh, hello?
Oh, hey, yeah. I can hear you now.
Yeah, if you could give me chat privileges, that would be ideal.
Yeah, definitely.
I also figured out how to pop out the YouTube chat so I can monitor it as well.
Yeah, whatever works best for you. I'll be here in case you miss any of them to let you know what happened, but yeah.
Cool. Appreciate it.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first CEDA lecture for this year's topic. True to form, we are starting with a topic lecture. Anthony Trufanov is here, one of the author of the legal personhood topic, ready to discuss the kind of big picture thoughts about legal personhood as the topic we have. And I'm just gonna leave it up to you, Anthony. Thank you so much for joining us and being willing to talk to us about your research and work on this.
Yeah, happy to be here. My pleasure. So the idea of this, I think, is I'm going to make a couple of fairly quick and fairly surface level comments. The idea of this is to give just a very, very broad overview, a very big picture overview of what are the main themes in the topic, what the main ideas behind the topic are. And then my hope is that you all will have some questions and we can have a little bit of a conversation afterwards to kind of address the points of confusion that are specific to you and specific to the things that you all want to know. I am monitoring the YouTube chat, so if you have a question, you can feel free to send a message there, and I will answer it. Okay, so the topic. The resolution is the United States should vest legal rights and/or duties in one or more of the following: artificial intelligence, nature, or non-human animal species. Now, before we unpack kind of the exotic or the meaty or the really interesting part of this at the end, I think it's really, really important for us to talk a little bit about this beginning part of the resolution that focuses on these rights and duties. And the reason that's important is that this resolution, this topic, we're debating about what kind of legal protections or what kind of legal principles should apply to a lot of these different entities that are becoming increasingly impactful in our day-to-day lives. And because this resolution specifically says we have to focus on these rights and duties, it's important to understand what makes rights and duties special, what makes rights and duties unique as a kind of legal protection, right? So why do we want rights and duties to attach to any entity, let alone the ones that are in the resolution? So we're focusing first on this beginning part. So to start off, let's try to understand what we mean by rights. So rights, very simply, are something that you or the rights holder are entitled to, something that is owed to you by society. So this is a very simple concept. And I think as an introductory caveat, I want to mention that a lot of these concepts, they have a very, very rich and very, very complicated philosophical background to them. And so when I give a definition, I don't mean to say that that's the only definition or that's the only thing that this word means, but there are lots and lots of people who disagree about what a right is, who should have them, and that's kind of why this is such an interesting and controversial topic. But I'm kind of giving a basic definition as a starting point. So rights, something that you're entitled to or something that is owed to you. Rights, depending on who you ask and depending on what philosophical tradition you're coming from, can have lots of different sources. On the screen, you can see a quote from the Declaration of Independence. This is a phrase that describes rights in the Declaration of Independence. It's the idea that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this view of rights is one possible view of where rights come from. This idea that some rights are natural or unalienable, the idea that there are these rights that cannot be separated from us. They are rights that we have just by virtue of who we are, just by virtue of the fact that we're humans, and because we were created as humans and we have certain freedoms, because of who we are, we naturally have certain rights. And according to this view, our rights didn't really come from anywhere. They exist in the universe because there's a natural, correct order to things, and there are certain things that people who are free and people who have rights simply deserve. And this makes this idea of natural rights very special because according to this view of natural rights, you can kind of recognize that someone has a natural right. Like, for example, a natural right not to be tortured, right? We would probably agree that that is something that all humans should or do have the right to. You can recognize the right not to be tortured. You can declare the right not to be tortured or invoke it. You can enforce the right not to be tortured by stopping someone from being tortured. But a natural right can never be taken away because it exists as a matter of natural law, as a matter of kind of the universe, as a matter of humans coming into being. Everyone has this right, and so it's impossible to take this right away. That's the meaning of this word unalienable. A different view of rights looks at them as a civil or a legal type of instrument. And this view of rights says that rights are not necessarily something that exists out there in the universe. It's not something that just happens, and it's not something with which we're endowed by our creator, but rather rights come from laws that are passed by governments. So rights are recognized by people with power, and those people with power protect, enforce, and provide for things that are rights. So this topic focuses a lot more on legal and civil rights, obviously, because we're recognizing legal rights and legal duties. But a lot of times these ideas are very closely intertwined, right? A lot of times governments recognize as legal rights things that a lot of people would say are already natural rights. So as an example here, the Declaration of Independence obviously calls these rights unalienable, and yet many of the same people who wrote this found it necessary to put into a legal document that human beings have particular rights. So there are these two kind of views of where rights come from. Another important thing to know about rights is that there can be positive rights and there can be negative rights. So positive rights are the idea that someone would have a right to do something or a freedom to do something. This is actions that you are entitled to have others take on your behalf, right? So an example of this could be a right to health or a right to medical care or to food or to education, right? These are positive rights because these are not things that you have the freedom to do without interference. These are things that other people have to provide for you, right? I have a right to have food given to me if I don't have it. I have a right to receive an education from someone else. I have a right to be taken care of medically, right? Even though I cannot take care of myself medically. So a lot of these are rights that come from things that other people have to do for me. And so these are positive rights. The opposite of positive rights is negative rights. These are freedom from. So whereas positive rights are freedom or rights to receive something, negative rights are freedom from interference. These are actions that you are entitled to have others not take in your direction. So a lot of things in the Bill of Rights are negative rights, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, right? I have a certain amount of freedom and it's not going to be infringed by somebody barging in and searching my stuff without permission from a court, or freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, or freedom from my life, liberty, or property being taken away from me without due process. So these are negative rights because this idea says I have a certain freedom already, and that freedom is not going to be taken away from me or interfered with by someone else that does something that interferes with or takes away my rights. So, question for you to think about: freedom of speech. Is it a positive right or is it a negative right? Pause here for you to think about it for like a couple seconds. So as I mentioned, a lot of the things in the Bill of Rights are negative rights. These are freedom from the government interfering with us. So freedom of speech is an example of a negative right. That's one that was a little bit confusing to me because you might think, oh, it's freedom to speak, right? But the idea of this is it's not really freedom to speak. It's a freedom to have the government not interfere with your speech. So one way to think about this is if freedom of speech were a positive right, then if you lacked the ability to speak for some reason, or you lacked the ability to make your voice heard, a positive right version of the freedom of speech would say that the government is obligated to provide you with the ability to speak, maybe provide you with a platform or to amplify your voice in some way, right? So that's not how the freedom of speech works. The freedom of speech is a freedom from interference with speech. So we know it's a negative right. Okay. So why are rights different from other kinds of protections? So generally speaking, there's a lot of different laws that protect our ability to do a variety of things, but there are reasons why rights are different and reasons why we would want to confer rights as opposed to other kinds of protections. One is this idea that rights are supposed to be above the political process. So rights are not meant to be something where you have the normal political tug of war where different interest groups are fighting each other and they're disagreeing about what kind of laws and what kind of legal protections we should have. Rights are supposed to be above that because they're fundamental. They're something that is part of the fabric or the constitution of our society. And so they're supposed to be free from political interference. They're guaranteed, they cannot be repealed. Once you have them, they can't be taken away. Now, of course, as this example hopefully illustrates, if you have been following the news at all recently, you should know that this is all kind of an ideal. In many cases, the promise of rights is not fulfilled, or the description of rights as above the political process or as being particularly strong in any other way, oftentimes the reality doesn't really live up to that ideal. And so a lot of times rights, even when promised, can retroactively eventually be taken away. But this is kind of the idea of why rights should, at least in theory, be stronger than other kinds of protections. So rights above the political process. Another thing that's important about rights is that rights are symbolically powerful, right? So because of the way that legal rights are intertwined with natural rights, what we were talking about earlier, when you say that something is a legal right, that use of the word right has a lot of symbolic power. It says something about who we are as a society, that we recognize something as a right, because that recognition says something about what we believe all members of our society should be entitled to. It says something about how we view the recipient of that right. It says that we view them as potentially more of an equal, that we view them as a counterpart, that we recognize their interests within the institutions that we've built, right? So because at bottom, rights, these are kind of a recognition of the interests of the person who has the rights, right? If the person didn't have interests, there would be no point in protecting their rights. So these rights are symbolic because having the laws says something about who we recognize as important, whose interests we care about, and what kind of things that we think that average members of our society should be able to do. Rights can be claimed by their beneficiary. This is also not always true. And again, I'm not really getting into the nitty-gritty here. There's a lot of legal details behind this, but rights are something that you can claim if you have it, in theory, right? It's your interest. So if you have an interest or if you have a right, you should have the ability to assert that right. If I have a freedom from searches and seizures that are unreasonable and the government searches my house anyway, I can assert my freedom from search and seizures that are unreasonable in a court and then receive some kind of legal remedy that solves the problem that was created by the unreasonable search and seizure. Rights can also be balanced against other rights. So for all these reasons, as I've said, rights are kind of a more fundamental or basic legal protection than a lot of other kinds of legal protection. And so a lot of times rights can function as this kind of trump card, right? Regardless of what else is going on in the political process, if someone wants to restrict my ability to do something, if that thing is a right, they can't do it. But just because I have rights, that doesn't mean that when my rights and someone else's rights come into conflict, my rights automatically win. So whereas rights are kind of a trump card that can defeat other kinds of political claims, rights versus rights is more of an equal fight where you could balance the different interests and try to come up with a resolution to that kind of problem. So this is an issue that I think is going to come up a lot on this topic, because when certain groups or certain types of entities have rights and other kinds of groups or other kind of entities don't have rights, the groups with rights are always going to be able to beat the groups without rights when their interests and rights are compared against each other. Because again, rights serve as this kind of trump card. So rights get you back into the game. They let you balance your interests against the interests of someone else who is also a rights holder. This brings us to duties. So remember, the topic says that we're expanding rights and or duties. So what are duties? And I put duties side by side with rights because duties can kind of be thought of as a flip side of rights. So whereas a right is something that you are entitled to or something that is owed to you, a duty is something that others are entitled to from you, or something that you owe to others. Or if not you, then the rights holder or the duties holder. So you can kind of see how these are flip sides of one another. one person's rights create another person's duties, either to do something in the case of positive rights or not to do something in the case of negative rights. So going back to our examples from earlier, the right to health or the right to medical care, what's the duty? Or the right to food or the right to education. So each of these implies duties for someone else. If one person has a right to health, that implies someone else has a duty to provide for that person's health or to provide the medical care. If one person has a right to food, that implies someone else has a duty to give them food. If one person has a right to education, that implies someone has a duty to educate them. So why do we need this concept of duties at all then? Like what's different about duties as opposed to rights if they're kind of describing two sides of the same coin? The reason is duties answer the question of whose duty it is. And if you think about it, if we don't answer this question, there could be a lot of different versions of the answer. So for right to food, there's a couple of different answers we could give for whose job it is or whose duty or whose obligation it is to fulfill this right. It could be the grocery store or the restaurant. And bear in mind, we don't have a right to food in the US, so this is all kind of hypothetical. But imagine we did have a right to food in the US. If you don't have food, who do you go to make the complaint? Who do you say has infringed or violated their duties? So if it's the grocery store or the restaurant, right, maybe that's it. Maybe if you're hungry and you can't pay and there's a right to food, you can walk into any grocery store and restaurant and take their food and eat it. Maybe it's a farmer. You can go up to any farm and you can ask them to give you any kind of food that you want. And then that could be the way that your right to food is satisfied. It could be the government. Maybe they have to enact policies to make sure that you're fed, right? So these answers are kind of all different in terms of the solutions that they suggest and in terms of what kind of remedies they imply are available. And some of them are obviously fairer than others, right? In some cases, your right to food infringes on someone else's right to property, right? Because if it's either of the first two answers, your right to food would imply you can go into anybody's store of food, take whatever food you want. That would seem to violate their right to property. With the government, maybe there's also some implications about redistribution or what kind of policies the government has to pass and which policies are sufficient to make sure that everyone is adequately fed, right? So this question of rights has a very open-ended set of implications about whose duty it might be. And so we need this extra piece, this duties piece, to specify whose duty it is and what the remedy should be when a particular right is not fulfilled. And there are specific examples of this, or kind of subsets of how having a duty clarifies the issue for us. So one thing it clarifies is what exactly needs to be done. So right to food, that's kind of abstract. Does that imply someone has a duty to feed me, or that someone has a duty to teach me how to run a farm or to give me land on which I can grow my crops, right? Open-ended answer to the question. Having a duty clarifies exactly what it must be done and exactly what others need to do for me. Duties also help us trace responsibility. Who is to blame when a right is infringed, right? So again, going back to our grocery store and farmer example, there's a lot of potential people who we could think of as being guilty if my right to food is infringed or limited in some way. So duties solve that problem because they help us point the finger and identify who exactly is derelict in their duties when my rights are not being satisfied. And then relatedly, duties also help us apportion liability. So this is a legal concept, right? If someone's liable, that means they're legally, not just morally responsible. And liability also tends to imply that whenever we right the wrong that has been committed, so my right has been violated, I don't have food, liability helps us answer the question of, well, we have to right the wrong, but at whose expense should we do that? So if someone's liable, that means that we need to right the wrong at that person's expense. So in an easy example, if two people crash the car and one person is responsible or liable, then it's that person's insurance that pays for the car crash. And so that person is the one at whose expense the wrongs need to be made right. So having laid that groundwork, let's kind of apply this set of ideas to some of the areas that we're focusing on here. So at first glance, you might think that it's not really natural to apply a lot of the stuff that I was just describing about rights and duties to some of these new entities, right? Artificial intelligence, how could artificial intelligence have interests? It's just a soulless machine. Or nature, how could it be responsible for anything? It doesn't really make decisions. It's not even one living thing. Same thing with non-human animal species. Many of them, don't even have thought processes or brains that we can understand as, performing thoughts or having experiences. How could they possibly be deserving of rights, or even worse, be deserving of having duties attached to them, right? So this all gets at this basic question of, when we think about who gets rights and duties, what are the kind of criteria that we think about? Why should we consider these new types of entities eligible for expanding or for receiving new rights and duties? So this all relates to a concept, and this is why this topic is labeled personhood. You might have noticed I haven't really been using the term personhood that much yet, but that's kind of because this idea of rights and duties is very related to this idea of personhood. So people who have rights and duties, or entities that have rights and duties, we generally think of those entities as persons. For moral rights and duties, we think of those as moral persons, or people who are morally deserving of consideration. Whereas for legal rights and duties, we think of those as legal persons, people deserving of legal consideration. So how do we decide who should have rights and who to blame when those rights are infringed? Well, one idea is sentience. So maybe we should expand rights and duties to things that are sentient, that have the ability to feel things, to perceive things, or to suffer. Maybe the criterion should be agency, the ability to exercise choice or control in a situation. So that seems to make some sense, right? Maybe I should have rights if I have an interest in not suffering and I can experience suffering as a negative thing. Maybe I should have a right not to have unnecessary suffering inflicted on me. Maybe I should have responsibility if I have the ability to choose my own actions. Reasoning is another common one, the ability to think about your actions. And you can see a lot of this traced in how we apply rights and duties to humans, right? In the case of criminal law, a lot of times agency and reasoning are ways that people defend themselves against responsibility. The legal system tries to attach responsibility to them for doing something, and they say, oh, this issue wasn't in my control, or maybe this person is a child, and so they shouldn't be held to as high of a standard of responsibility as an adult because they're not as able to reason about their actions, right? So that's another potential category. Autonomy is another one, the ability to act independently based on your own interests. So if you don't have the ability to act independently, if you're the puppet of someone or something else, then maybe that is a reason why you don't deserve responsibility for something. Social relations. Maybe it's enough to recognize someone as deserving of rights that people think that they're deserving of rights. Maybe rights and duties are a social thing where we just give it to whoever we consider to be responsible, or someone that we consider needs to provide their services to someone else, or someone that we subjectively perceive as deserving of concern in the case of rights. So these all seem like pretty high bars. Remember, our topic covers these three strange areas: artificial intelligence, nature, and these non-human animal species. So, one would think a lot of these categories may or may not necessarily apply to a lot of those different entities. Could we really fairly say that an artificial intelligence is reasoning when it makes decisions or performs actions? Can we really say that an animal is exercising agency? Maybe it's just running some pre-existing evolutionary code. Is nature capable of acting autonomously? Is it even an agent at all? Is it fair to say that nature is doing something, or is nature just this abstract thing that we can't really think of as an actor, or as something that is doing things? So seems like a pretty high bar. And that's because there's a piece missing from this list of criteria. Now, before I give away what this piece is, I want you to imagine something. I want you to picture this, right? I want you to picture a world in which we live and we're surrounded by these artificial non-human rights bearers. We've created these entities. They're all around us. We live among them. And they're everywhere in our lives. They're really powerful. We have relationships with these entities. We potentially trust them. Some people say that they love them. Some people feel betrayed by them. And we might have been the ones that created them in the first place, but they've gotten so powerful that they've grown beyond the reach of any one person, and no one person can control what they do. Seems like a pretty powerful, pretty disconcerting image. How might life be different if the world that we lived in was like that? Now that you've thought about that for a second, I'm going to give away that this question is a trick question, because this is the world we live in now. These entities are called corporations. These corporations, if we go back to this slide, they're artificial, they're non-human. We have relationships with them, so they're part of our social fabric. We made them, but people don't necessarily control them. Sometimes there's boards of directors or investors, but those people are collectives. No one person controls them. And sometimes corporations do things that no one of the members would want them to do because they are bound by laws. The laws have created particular boundaries or particular things that corporations have to do, regardless of whether their directors want them to. So these corporations are already an example of something that has personhood in our society that is not human, that is artificial, that is a human creation. And you would think, that doesn't really make sense. Like corporations, we know that they have rights. We know that they have obligations. You can sue them. They can sue someone else if their rights have been wronged for some reason. But how does that make sense? How does that square with this list of things? Corporations, if you separate them from their humans, they're not sentient. Maybe they're agents, but they definitely can't reason. They might be autonomous and might have social relations, but if they're not sentient and can't reason, how could we possibly say that they're persons? How can we possibly say that they should have rights and duties? And that's because of this final answer or final criterion for what matters, for what we give rights and duties to, and that's convenience, right? There's a lot of these objective criteria for what has rights and what doesn't have rights. And that might help us answer this natural question. Remember, I started with this difference between natural rights or inalienable rights versus legal or civil rights. And maybe these qualities or these adjectives or criteria help us answer that first question of what is a natural right and who should get to have it. But at bottom, we're talking here about legal rights and legal duties. And who has legal rights and legal duties is entirely decided by the legal system, right? So convenience. When is it convenient for the legal system to treat an entity as being autonomous or as being sentient or as making its own decisions as opposed to someone else? Why is it convenient for us to have corporations be rights holders or duties bearers? This is obviously a point of controversy, but some of the reasons why include if a corporation does something wrong, but none of the individual members of the corporation are really guilty, right? So the corporation as a whole did something, maybe it resulted in some deaths, maybe the whole corporation manufactured a product that broke and that was hurting people, right? If you go to court and want to sue that corporation and get money because you were injured by them, you wouldn't want to have to prove that individual people within that corporation were the ones that harmed you. Not only because it's really hard to prove that, but also because those individual people often don't have the kind of money that's required to pay for the massive harms that corporations, as powerful as they are, can do to society. So it's convenient for us to imagine that corporations are people on their own, because then it's really easy. You can show that corporations are responsible, and you can draw on the corporation's independent resources to try to right that wrong, to try to make them liable and redistribute resources in a way that the rights are no longer infringed or that the interests are no longer infringed, right? Why would corporations have rights? Well, because simply put, in our capitalist system, we want people to invest money in corporations. We want economic growth to exist. We want people to have confidence that as investors, their interests are going to be protected and their money is not going to go to waste. So this idea of capital formation helps explain why, as a matter of convenience, we've made corporations independent people, right? So when you think about a lot of these areas, think about some of these categories. AF and neg teams are going to argue either that some of these entities naturally deserve rights and for moral reasons we should therefore extend them, or they might argue that there are social relationships that are best represented by giving rights to artificial intelligence or to nature or to animals, or we might simply say that it's convenient. It's the best way to protect animals. It's the best way to help us deal with the kind of complicated problems that are being created by the rise of AI. And I'll wrap this up by just giving a couple of really, really quick examples. So in the case of an AI, let's think about a self-driving car that gets into an accident. This is a common problem that a lot of people in this area deal with. So this obviously gets to the question of duties and liability. Who is responsible when a self-driving car gets into an accident? This question is really important because this question of responsibility determines who has to pay money, who is held responsible at all. So maybe no one's responsible. And then the answer is whoever got into the accident is simply out of luck because there's nobody that was responsible. It was just the robot doing it, right? You know, and it might be easier enough to say, oh, the corporation that designed the car should be the one responsible. But then doesn't that let the driver off the hook? Or if the driver is entirely responsible, the flip side, doesn't that let the corporation off the hook? Maybe there's some middle ground where there's a distribution of responsibility, but maybe it's not entirely either of their fault, right? Maybe a human driver could have prevented the accident, but it wasn't the car's fault because the car wasn't doing something wrong. The car would have had to do some extraordinary maneuvers that only a human was capable of to prevent the accident. Or maybe the car caused the accident by trying to avoid a worse accident, right? These are a lot of very, very complicated questions that the law has figured out ways to deal with for humans, but AI adds this new wrinkle, which is that a lot of the important decisions aren't being made by a person. They're being made by this piece of software that is applying these rules in an unpredictable way. And if the program was written entirely in advance, this also might be an easy question. Maybe we would still just blame the developer because they're the ones that wrote the bad program that caused the accident. But with how complicated a lot of these programs are, with a lot of the ways in which these programs behave in unexpected ways, with a lot of the ways that these programs improve over time, or they improve as a result of the input of so many people that it's hard to attach the blame to any one person. Or even with open source projects, there are autonomous cars and autonomous car programs that are not written by any company, but are written by a community of developers. Who do you blame then? Attaching these responsibilities to the AI itself helps us answer that question. Because if you're the one who was wronged, or if you were injured, or if your property was destroyed because of an accident triggered by a self-driving car, it tells us who to blame. And so as a matter of convenience, it simplifies this question of finding responsibility. Another example is nature. This gets at this idea of rights serving as a trump card. If I have a right in my property and I use my property rights to destroy the natural environment around me, how can our legal system meaningfully protect that natural environment if my rights as a person entitle me to do things that are destructive? There are obviously regulations, but there's also a symbolic cost. If our legal system fundamentally elevates the interests of people over the interests of natural environments, that clearly signals that some people's interests are considered, whereas other entities' interests are not considered at the same level. If two interests are in contest, i.e., a human community has to destroy a natural community in order for it to survive, whose interests should win out? These are simple moral questions, but they have complicated legal answers in terms of how we should define our environmental protection laws, given the importance of protecting our environment as environmental crises get worse and worse. There are also alternative worldviews that think of nature as being sentient, as having agency, or think of it as an entity with which we are in a social relationship. So there might be those reasons to recognize nature's personhood as well. So I'm not going into a ton of detail about these apps because I would encourage you all to go out and do some reading on your own. There's a lot of writing, especially recently, about expanding rights and duties in all of these different areas. But hopefully this basic set of terms and this basic set of definitions has given you kind of a foundation that you can use to branch out and to do some of that reading on your own and decide which of these entities you would like to do your arguments, you would like your arguments to focus on. So with that, does anyone have any questions? I'll do the screen share here. Oh, Jackie, you know what? Since the stream is delayed, it's also potentially, I'm not looking at the stream right now, but I'm not sure. We might get a delayed read of the questions as well.
Okay, let me double check on my end to see if I see it. I'm not seeing anything on the YouTube. Oh, I see what you're saying. Like the live stream screen is
Yeah,
still.
yeah, yeah. Like I think it's that way on purpose, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Maybe give people like a minute.
Yeah.
In the meantime, that was great. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Yeah, of course. Hopefully it was helpful.
I definitely know that my novices listening in thought it was very helpful. So
Nice. I'm glad to hear it. I wasn't sure how much detail to go into, but
no, this is great. I do see Michael wrote a question in the chat, which is, does conferring a right typically result in that entity becoming a bearer of duties?
yeah, that's a good question. So I would say there are reasons that those ideas are related to each other. So a lot of what I was talking about on that slide where I was listing off some of the criteria for why we would decide something is a bearer of rights or duties, they're kind of interlinked with each other, right? So somebody who has agency is somebody who we would more likely attach responsibility to, but somebody who has agency is also likely someone who is sentient or someone who can reason or someone who could express, thoughts about why they're doing the things that they're doing. And that kind of entity is also very likely to be the kind of entity we would want to protect with rights. So there's definitely a logical linkage between these ideas. I would say at minimum, when you say someone has a right, it at least makes it so someone else likely has a duty. But it is often the case that the same or similar kinds of entities that we give rights to are the same kinds of entities that we would want to give duties to. Would I think that rights and duties are all that goes into legal personhood? And do I think the affirmative has a right to be able to grant full personhood? So I don't necessarily know what you mean by full personhood in this context. So there is definitely, as I suggested, a little bit of a difference, at least, between legal personhood and moral personhood. So where legal personhood is just that the legal system recognizes your interests, moral personhood would say that, morally speaking, you are deserving of your interests being considered. So if you mean full personhood in that sense, there is, I would say, no way that the affirmative can fiat that the United States should give moral personhood to a lot of these entities. As far as legal personhood is concerned, it's a pretty elastic term in some ways. Like there's a lot of debate, especially recently, about what exactly legal personhood entails. I think most people would agree that legal personhood, generally speaking, refers to having the capacity for rights and duties being assigned to you, having standing to make your interests heard in a legal dispute. So kind of more broadly than rights and duties generally, we would be saying like rights and you would be saying like anytime you have an interest that is attached to you, you can express that interest in your own terms rather than expressing that interest in terms of how it affects other people's interests. The idea that another phrase that's used to describe that idea is that you're an autonomous center of legal relations. You can be represented in the legal system in a vacuum without being attached to your relationship to something else. So I would say all of those things are kind of natural consequences of saying that someone has their own rights and duties and would be a component of vesting rights and duties in an entity. But I would say that is maybe debatable. I said rights imply duties. Is the inverse true? Does the first conferring a duty imply that another entity has a right? Yeah, I mean, insofar as the duty is outwards oriented. Like we don't really, I mean, our legal system doesn't really, I'm trying to think if there's an example of a time where this isn't the case. I would say in the vast majority of cases, if you have a duty, then someone else has the ability to make a claim against you when you fail to fulfill your duty. So, for example, if a corporation has a duty not to pollute, then there is someone likely in society who, if a corporation were to pollute and injure someone, that person could then arguably bring a claim and say that the corporation has violated their duties. A thing that I want to note here is when I say that rights and duties are mirror images of each other, I mean that kind of broadly conceptually. I don't necessarily mean like there are literal legal rights being created, and whether or not you actually have a claim in the legal system is a really, really complicated legal question that is governed by a huge body of law, and who gets liability and how that's apportioned is all also governed by entirely separate bodies of law. So I'm kind of glossing a lot of that over. There are a lot of times when there are rights without legal remedies. There are a lot of times when there are legal duties, and if they get violated, there's nobody who can kind of bring a claim about that. But I'm just saying conceptually, these are mirrors of each other, and it's helpful to think of them as mirrors of each other, just in terms of understanding the broad outlines of what the topic is. How should United States be defined in this resolution? I think that the main debate about that will be whether United States requires the federal government or not. I would probably say that the best reading of the resolution is that it does not require the federal government, but there will be a debate about the meaning of the United States in this resolution. Arguably it requires kind of broad national action, maybe. So as distinct from maybe an individual city or an individual municipality, maybe that's not the United States, maybe something broader is required. But I think there's definitely going to be some debate about that. Yeah, Laura, hopefully when I circled back to talk about legal personhood in particular, I answered that component of the question. So again, legal personhood, kind of an elastic term, could potentially mean a lot of things. There are many, some authors call this incidents of legal personhood, or another way to think about it is indicia of legal personhood. So ways that you can tell something is a legal person. And there is a variety of these factors, like ability to sue and be sued, having legal rights, having legal duties, being an autonomous center of legal relations. And some of that goes beyond rights. Some of it is a logical implication of rights. But yeah. Luke asks, do you have any thoughts on what a lawsuit against nature would look like if it was granted personhood? Corporations as entities have the ability to pay out damages, but how would others do so? So there's a lot of potential answers to these questions. So some of this depends on the area, and some of it depends on even the kind of right or the kind of duty that you're trying to create. So I'm actually going to take on this question a little bit more broadly than just with nature, because the same type of issue comes up in a lot of different cases. So if you think about it, and you think about it in the context of corporations, why is it that corporations as entities have the ability to pay out damages? Well, it's because we have decided that one of the legal rights that a corporation has is the ability to own property. We can write down in our legal system that there is a certain set of property that is attached to the corporation as opposed to some other entity. And that is the reason why, it's a matter of legal construction, the corporation has assets from which to pay out liabilities. So that same broad answer is the way that you should think about a lot of the other things I'm about to say, which is that there are many different kinds of arrangements that could potentially serve as solutions to this problem. Not all of them are important. In a lot of cases, when you talk about the symbolic benefits of attaching rights and duties to something, the enforcement question is less important than having merely said that rights and duties attach to a particular entity. But some examples of ways that it could work are you could do something similar to a corporation and say that the entity has assets and has the ability to own property from which to pay out liabilities. One interesting example of this that authors in the area like to give is that in New York City, one of the problems that taxi cab companies were facing was that you'd be a corporation that owns a bunch of taxis, and if one driver got into an accident and caused a massive amount of damage, maybe like you have one idiot driver, they got drunk, they like destroyed a bunch of property. You don't want to make it so the corporation as a whole is on the hook. Like if one accident could spell the end of the entire taxi company, that would be a real problem. And so the way New York City solved this problem is by making it so you can actually incorporate an individual taxi cab as its own corporation. And the idea of this was that since it's a separate legal person, this taxi cab, this individual car, and the driver that's attached to it is its own corporate entity, the liabilities that could be incurred by that person getting in an accident are limited to that taxi cab, that independent company. It doesn't spill over to the whole taxi company. But the legal trade-off was that as a result of, this obviously can be abused, right? Because if someone causes a bunch of property damage, you want somebody to pay for it. So the way that they solved this was you can incorporate your taxi cab as a company, but you have to put some amount of assets into that company to make it so that that company can pay out stuff, right? So for the AI example, there's no reason why an AI taxi cab company couldn't be structured in the same way, where the AI is its own legal person, but a condition of becoming a legal person that drives an autonomous car that has a taxi cab business is that there have to be assets that are attached to that legal person. So that's one answer. Another answer is human oversight. If an animal were to bring a rights claim, likely it would be a human lawyer bringing the claim. It would be a human lawyer presenting the case in court. And in non-human rights cases, historically, that has been the way that it works. A lawsuit against nature is the particular question that you asked. I would say that that is an uncommon proposal. Like people don't really talk about suing nature because nature did something wrong. That would imply the nature has duties, which is something that people are a little bit more uncomfortable with. But some similar structure potentially could be in place where just as there are human representatives that would represent nature in a rights case, there might be human representatives that represent nature in a duties case. And there's many, many different solutions to this. One other one, the last one that I'll name, is that some people propose solving this problem for AI by requiring the developer of the AI to buy insurance for claims against the AI in case the AI ends up being liable for anything. And then that insurance company would pay out the liabilities, and that's how the money would be provided. So a lot of different answers to this question, but it's definitely an important one and something where the app has to take a position and likely do some research. I think that answers Tim's next question too. If we give animals rights, can humans have a duty to enforce it? I think the answer is yes. That's probably the way that it would happen. Can apps include more than one of the options, e.g. non-human animals in nature in their plan, or must they pick one? I believe the resolution says you're allowed to pick multiple. Yep, the resolution says vest legal rights and or duties in one or more of the following: AI, nature, non-human animal species. So it can be multiple. Oh, Jack, you already said that. Perfect.
All right. Thank you all for these great questions. Thank you, Anthony, for coming and answering them. This was great. So wherever you are watching, give Anthony a round of applause. Gave his own time to do this voluntarily. So that was great. So stay tuned. We're going to have more series lectures to come, and I'll post them on the CEDA Facebook as we do it. All right.
Thanks, Jackie.
Mm-hmm.